summer, my Democratic colleagues got through on reconciliation, a strictly partisan way, a bill that provided that IRS would get $80 billion in mandatory funding, which was meant to double the size of the IRS by 87,000 employees. This additional $80 billion, which comes on top of its annual appropriation, is over 6 times more than it received through annual appropriations in 2022. Now, I expect the new Congress, starting January 3rd next year, there's going to be an attempt to reduce the $80 billion and not go for the 87,000 additional employees. I favor doing just that. However, in the meantime, the $80 billion and the 87,000 employees is law. And so this unprecedented increase in funding demands that Congress have a comparable increase in congressional oversight of the IRS. Exacting and unyielding oversight, to be precise. After all, we're talking about 87,000 new employees. To begin this oversight, Finance Committee Republicans, including this senator, sent a letter to the Government Accountability Office in October in pursuit of this oversight. In that letter, we asked for information on outstanding issues that the Government Accountability Office has identified at the Internal Revenue Service and the status of recommendations the IRS has failed to implement. The Government Accountability Office responded to that letter at the end of November, and as you might quite expect, there are many ongoing and persistent issues. In the November letter, the Government Accountability Office notes that the, quote, IRS had 41 unimplemented recommendations related to information systems control deficiencies at the beginning of the fiscal year 2022 audit of the IRS financial statements, end of GAO quote. These outstanding recommendations related to information systems control deficiencies are especially concerning given the recent unauthorized disclosure of taxpayer information contrary to the U.S. Code Section 6103, which guarantees the privacy, or is supposed to guarantee the privacy, of your IRS information. As you'll recall, almost a year and a half ago, ProPublica, a publication, published stories based on, quote, a vast trove of Internal Revenue Service data, end of quote. We're no closer to understanding how ProPublica obtained this confidential taxpayer data now that we were any more now than we were in June of 2021. I've sent multiple letters to the Internal Revenue Service and to the Justice Department requesting updates on their supposed investigations on this matter of how did ProPublica get this private information of individual taxpayers. Yet, these agencies, the IRS and the Justice Department, have failed to provide any information concerning how confidential taxpayer information was disclosed or if additional taxpayer data remains at risk. In fact, just last week, we learned of another confirmed data breach. The IRS inadvertently redisclosed information from tax returns filed by tax-exempt organizations. This is after the information was already improperly disclosed in September. The IRS clearly has a problem then, protecting taxpayer information as the law requires. Now, the 41 information systems deficiencies are only a fraction of the total open recommendations identified by the Government Accountability Office. So GAO has said that, quote, as of November 2022, IRS had 176 open recommendations. Fully implementing these recommendations could significantly improve the IRS's operation, end of quote. Despite IRS's shortcomings, my Democrat colleagues handed the IRS $80 billion in additional funding without seeing its plan for the funds or including the additional oversight. So that's why we're calling on additional oversight is very important to protect this $80 billion. Moreover, my Democratic colleagues have heavily weighted the additional funding towards enforcement rather than updating its systems or taxpayer services. Because you can hardly call the IRS and get a live person. If you do, you probably don't get the right answers to your questions. So taxpayer service ought to be the #1 goal of this additional $80 billion instead of enforcement. Specifically, more than half of the additional IRS funding is dedicated to enforcement, while less than 5% is for taxpayer services. So you can see taxpayer services isn't high on the agenda of the IRS. The lopsided nature of the IRS funding raises legitimate concerns of overly aggressive tax enforcement. This is especially true given 3 2/10 million tax filers are still waiting for the IRS to process their 2022 tax returns. Countless others are trying to voluntarily comply with the law, but can't get anyone at the IRS to answer the telephone. As a result, my office has been flooded with calls from frustrated Iowans requesting assistance in getting the information that they need from the IRS, getting the services they need from the IRS. This is a recipe for disaster. While serving on the 1998 IRS Restructuring Commission, I heard firsthand from small businesses and from individuals some of the abusive tactics the IRS can use when enforcement takes priority over taxpayer services. Given these and other concerns, Senator Thune and I introduced the IRS Funding Accountability Act. Our bill would place a moratorium on IRS spending its additional funding, other than for taxpayer services, until the IRS submits its spending plan to Congress for approval. Congress would then have the option to reject the plan. If Congress approves the spending plan, the IRS and the Treasury would be subject to regular reporting requirements and incur financial penalties for non-compliance. In other words, enhancing Congress's constitutional responsibility of oversight to see that the money spent is intended by Congress. As the former chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, I understand the necessity for enforcement. Taxpayers should pay what they owe and not a penny less or a penny more. During my time on the Finance Committee, I've worked to provide the IRS with additional tools to identify tax cheats and to collect tax debt that are already due and owed. For instance, I helped create the bipartisan IRS private debt collection program, which uses private contractors to track down and collect taxes owed to the IRS that they've shelved as a very low priority. This program has collected nearly $3 billion in net revenue since fiscal year 2019, including over $1 3/10 billion in the fiscal year 2022 alone. Every year this program has operated, it's brought more revenue into the Treasury. Additionally, I offered improvements to the IRS whistleblower program in 2006. This program incentivizes whistleblowers to expose tax fraud by corporations and high net worth individuals. Since 2007, this program has collected over $6 billion from non-compliant taxpayers. Both of these programs are proven, initially received resistance from the IRS. However, I appreciated former Commissioner Reddick's public support for both of these programs. If President Biden is really committed to closing the tax gap and going after wealthy tax cheats, he should encourage his nominee for IRS Commissioner Daniel Wehrfeld to embrace both these programs. The IRS has significant and persistent issues that need to be addressed. Congress must exercise robust and aggressive oversight. This is especially true given the outrageous infusion of $80 billion that's mostly geared towards enforcement against the taxpayers. The IRS must do a better job protecting taxpayer data, provide better taxpayer service, and use its existing enforcement tools and regular appropriation funding more efficiently. Simply put, that's what the taxpayers deserve. Now, on